Welcome once again to LAC IGF 13. We hope you enjoyed your lunch. We'll now start with session number 2, the Internet and the Pandemic Opportunities and Impact of Deployed Technologies on Human Rights. The countries of Latin America and the Caribbean have been strongly affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has seriously impacted their emerging economies and faced them with the challenge of protecting the health of their population while ensuring the continuity of the most important social activities, such as education and work. In the context of the pandemic, technology is one of the components incorporated by the governments of the region in their search for solutions, very often with support or services provided by the private sector for their deployment. This session proposes a critical review of the role that the technologies implemented during the pandemic have played in the protection of human rights and the lessons learned from this situation regarding their role in the future development of our societies, and on how to promote balanced public and private policies for an increased respect and promotion of the rights of the region's inhabitants. For this session, we have two groups of speakers. They have been divided according to the topic to discuss. The moderator is Maria Paz Canales. In the first group, we'll be discussing the use of data-intensive technology in the context of COVID-19. The second group will deal with technology and public policy, the challenges of information and transparency in the context of the pandemic. Let me remind you that you can share your impressions on the event in Twitter using the hashtag LACIGF13. We encourage all participants to write their questions in the Q&A panel, and these will be responded when the time comes. Welcome, Maria Paz, with the first segment, use of data-intensive technology in the context of COVID-19. Thank you very much, Claudia. Welcome to this second session of LAC IGF 13. It is a privilege for me to be the moderator of this session. We have very interesting participants. I'm sorry, there is an echo. She's asking whether she was the only one who heard it, so let me go on. We have very interesting participants, as Claudia was saying, divided into two blocks. The first block will include 10-minute presentations by 3 panelists, followed by 20 minutes for interaction with the public. So I encourage you that if you have any questions that you have during the activity, to write them in the Q&A panel, which we will then show to the panelists, read out to the panelists. So having said that, I will now introduce our panelists. I will introduce the 3 members of the panel, and then ask them to make their presentations on this topic of the use of data-intensive technology in the context of COVID-19. We have Laura McGorman, who is policy leader in the Facebook working area, and she works on the development of data in order to find the potential benefit of public interest in initiative called Data for Good. Following that, we'll be listening to Rafael Zanatta. He is a director of data privacy in Brazil. This is an organization, a civil society organization that researches and works with litigations on issues related to privacy. And finally, this session will be closed with the presentation by Ricardo Oliva. He's administrator of the National Authority for Government Innovation from the Government of Panama, AIG. So let me now give the floor to the first speaker, Laura McGorman. Thank you, Laura.
Translation. This is new for me, so I will do my best to work with the technology, but I appreciate you're all working with my presentation in English. The mission of the Data for Good team at Facebook is to use data to address some of the world's greatest humanitarian issues. Facebook, as most of you likely know, has tremendous reach around the world with more than 2 billion people that use our platform. And as a result, we believe on the Data for Good team that if you are able to aggregate this data in privacy-preserving ways, it can be shared to address some of the world's greatest humanitarian issues. I'll go over some of the major types of products that we've shared in the context of the coronavirus pandemic. However, Facebook Data for Good has actually been a team and a project that has existed since 2017. We do a great deal of work sharing data in the form of maps, which we call Maps for Good. We also do surveys on the Facebook platform, benefiting from the tremendous reach of our platform to get people to respond to surveys on issues like whether or not they're experiencing coronavirus symptoms or whether or not they're an owner of a small business that might be in need of particular types of support. And then lastly, we do projects called Insights for Impact that uses information from data sets that are publicly posted to better understand how populations care about key issues. Some of our data sets are publicly available. We have an instance on what is called Humanitarian Data Exchange, which is run by the United Nations, and we share a page on their data sharing surface, as well as a page on Amazon Web Services. And some of our data sets are only available through license agreements. And we sign license agreements with nonprofits and universities to get access to different types of data under specific terms for specific purposes, such as research related to the coronavirus or potentially by NGOs responding to natural disasters. Just to give you an overview of what our partnership landscape has looked like in the last 6 months, we started out in 2017 with a handful of partners. And then where you see this line is actually the coronavirus pandemic onset. So at the beginning of 2020, we actually had around 100 nonprofit and university counterparts we were working with around the world. And now we have nearly 400. So it's been an enormous time of growth for our program, given the need for real-time information at a very different scale to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a brief picture showing where we have partners around the world. So we're very proud that Data for Good is a very global program. Every country shaded in blue here is where we have Data for Good partners who've signed license agreements with us to get access to the protected data sets. And we're very appreciative of these global partnerships around the world, including in the LATAM region. I want to start to really address the issue of privacy protection, because before I get into the actual substance of the work, I think it's very important to talk about privacy protection as a first order. I actually sit within Facebook's privacy and data policy team, and our team reports into the Chief Privacy Officer because we believe that privacy protection is just as important as the life-saving capability of the data sets that we share. This is a small overview of some of the protections we put in place. It's not exhaustive, and I'm happy to answer more questions if people have questions about the specifics. One major way in which we protect our data sets is through access control. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we will often make a country level version of a data set available publicly, a very, very aggregated version. But then we'll only make more granular data available to particular universities and nonprofits that we can actually monitor their use more closely. And so that's one high level way that we protect individual privacy. We also have a backbone of user control in the data sets that we share. So every single survey that I'll talk about today is an opt-in survey. People can always choose not to respond to surveys. And the consent language for our surveys specifically states that if you choose to participate in a Facebook on-platform survey, that information will be used for research. So there's not only opt-in, but specific consent language that users say, yes, this is okay to use this information for research purposes or public health purposes. Another example of user control is that we only share data when we share aggregated location information from people who have opted into a feature called location history. This means that for many, many, many people, the majority of people who use Facebook on their mobile phones, we are not sharing their location information as part of Data for Good because we rely specifically on opt-in consent for that. Some other ways in which we protect privacy in our Maps products are that we can add random noise to obscure the exact number of users to a particular area of a map that might be small. We can also use a technique called smoothing, which really refers to creating a weighted average, again, to make it difficult to determine the precise number of users in a particular area. We also have a simple technique of dropping small counts of users from our data sets when we're in a part of the globe potentially that population density is low. We will completely remove those parts of the world from our analysis. And then last but not least, in the last 6 months, I'm sorry. I don't know what that echo was about, but I will continue. Lastly, we use a differential privacy framework, which I'm happy to answer more questions about. But that is the latest and greatest as we share data publicly. We use that differential privacy framework to make re-identification virtually impossible. And again, these are just some examples of the privacy protections in play. Going through our data sets, which I will go through somewhat quickly to leave time for the other panelists, we have population density maps that actually include no Facebook data whatsoever, but they do include satellite imagery and census data. And Facebook has processed this information because we know we have some of the world's best data scientists, and we also have some of the most robust compute power in the world. So a small example of how we're using AI to compute population density around the world is that we take the satellite imagery from space. Here's an example of Great Britain and Niger, and we can identify in the satellite imagery parts of the world that have structures and parts that don't have structures. Here's an example from Namibia. So you see a map as you could see on Google Earth, and here's where our AI predicts there are structures. The reason this is powerful is because census data alone will only tell you very large areas where a large population lives. But when we use AI and combine that with census information, we can get much more granular insights because people tend to live in structures. So the combination of the two means much higher resolution population density information. An example here is our map from Nigeria for the population of those living over the age of 60, which is an important vulnerable group that we need to focus protection for from COVID-19. And one of the many examples of how this data set has been used is by our counterparts at the World Bank, who recently used our population density layer for the Democratic Republic of Congo to identify potential hotspots of COVID-19 in Kinshasa. We also have location information that can be very helpful for measuring the extent to which lockdown and stay-at-home orders are being adhered to around the world. These are called movement range data sets. And here you can see the actual trends in movement range across counties in the state of California. This is very important because as public policy changes around the world, there will be lockdown orders, there will be stay-at-home orders, and then there will be gradual reopening. We need to see the extent to which populations are still out and about or whether or not populations are generally staying home. So here's a very small window into across the European continent, the proportion of people who stayed put throughout March and April. You can see as lockdown orders went into effect in March, many parts of France and Spain had many portions of the population staying home. But then as lockdown orders started to decrease throughout the month of May, fewer people stayed home. And so this is just one example of a real-time insight that can be used to see how public policy is affecting human behavior around the world at an aggregate level. This is very important for public policy. On the left, you can see Governor Newsom and his team reporting on this information during a California press conference on the left around lockdown orders. And on the right-hand side, you can actually see a conference with the president of Mexico reviewing the same data by region in Mexico to figure out if lockdown orders were working across the country of Mexico. So it's very helpful for decision-making around stay-at-home policies. We also have information on friendships. As people know, we operate the world's largest social network, and so you can use that information to understand aggregate information on friendship connections around the world. Why is this helpful? Because we recently found out through research done by Massachusetts Institute of Technology that human behavior is highly influenced by social networks. And so they found that lockdown orders were actually much more influenced by who you're friends with rather than the public policy itself. And so they found that friend networks are just as influential on human behavior in terms of whether or not people choose to stay home and likely whether or not people choose to wear masks based on friendship ties. And so this aggregate information on friendship ties around the world can help provide an insight into potential not only pathways of the disease, but how preventive measures might be adopted around the world. We have information on co-location, which is another aggregated insight as to how likely populations are to come in contact with each other. And this is one example from Taiwan, where hotspots were detected using our co-location metrics. And we also have surveys. The Future of Business survey is a survey of small businesses on Facebook, an opt-in survey. And one insight in particular showed that for every SMB around the world, there was a much higher likelihood that that small business had closed based on the stringency of the lockdown order in their country. And so again, we can use information from not only mobile phones, opt-in location information, but survey information that people choose to share to better understand things like small business closures and the need for financial assistance around the world. We also, I'll close here, have a COVID-19 symptom survey. This is actually a novel survey that is taken off the Facebook platform, but we do promote it on Facebook through what's called a quick promotion at the top of newsfeed. And around 1.5 million people take this survey every week. 17 million people have taken it to date. And this can help us understand the rate at which people are experiencing COVID-like illness around the world. So recently you can see here that there was a high proportion of people in the state of Texas experiencing COVID-like symptoms. And that actually correlates with the number of cases in the state of Texas. And this information, we actually just recently launched an innovation challenge because we do believe that symptom information can provide early warning signs for actual outbreaks. And we hope to partner with the public health community to get ahead of outbreaks using this information. So that concludes my presentation. I really look forward to hearing the additional panelists sharing their views on this important topic. And I thank you so much for the time.
Muchas gracias, Laura. Muy interesante presentación.
Thank you, Laura. That was a very interesting presentation showing all the potential usages of the information that was collected specifically on the purpose of public interest needs brought about by the pandemics and how Facebook can cooperate also and also some other companies, but it is very interesting to see this angle of right protection and privacy protection that you talked about at the beginning, and transparency, showing the public how the information is gathered and used. And in the same line, we wanted to listen about the challenges perceived by the civil society as to the use of information, of data. So we wanted to ask Rafael Zanatta, who's the Director of Data Privacy Brazil, who will tell us about his view of how he views those challenges. Thank you, Rafael. Welcome. Thank you.
Rafael va a hacer su presentación en portugués, así que quienes necesiten pueden ir al icono de interpretación, que es el mundo que está
Rafael
en el...
speak Portuguese, so you can listen to the right corner And you can listen to your language of choice and listen to the versions. Thank you. Well, I was told that it was better to speak in just one language, so I'm going to speak Portuguese. It's a pleasure to be here, and I am the director of an NGO, Data Privacy in Brazil. We conduct surveys, we conduct research related with technology and personal data protection, with the technology that involves the use of data, which is essential. And we have a project that's called Data and Viruses that was launched shortly after the onset of the pandemic. That is March 17th, after we acknowledged the global challenge facing the pandemic. And so the idea was to see how countries as Brazil, for instance, we have our headquarters in Sao Paulo, and trying to see the impact of the political decisions on technology and how personal data protection and privacy are so relevant in this case. So we started with weekly forums to analyze the news about with the technology providers and the proposals by the governors, the states, and the projects developed and implemented in the different places, and the queries and the questions about those projects. So we took a stat of the situation in 2 months, and here I'd like to highlight a couple of points that strike us about the surveillance of the data, the oversight of the data, that and we are trying to share it with a number of experts. Maria Paz was part of a group that worked with this, that and the idea precisely was to work to see how to handle this problem. So our argument was, our position is that it's not a question of choosing personal data to fight against the disease, but the idea is how we should use technology. Laura mentioned many innovative and bright ideas. For instance, showing hotspots from the air, trying to innovate and to do something about the pandemic. And we faced this problem too. And we discussed it with experts from the different companies, precisely discussing the ethical issues. And we completed this document in April that is called Privacy During and Pandemic, that discusses all the ethical problems, all the ethical issues acknowledged by all the stakeholders. So what worries us about this? We are worried about this seductive opening of the discourse of the apps that may be harmful, that for instance, we are first of all worried about the technological solutions, as if the solution of the problems would be only technology based, which is not. And also the public resources and the solutions designed with technology to address the current problems. The first thing that appeared in Brazil and probably in other countries is the index of isolation, the isolation index. The technology companies present their data, social isolation index. They show the data about movement and deployment, and to see where there are clusters of population, where people get crowded using sensors in the mobile phones with GPS. That's one of the specific ways they do it, and that is done in some cities in Brazil. Of course, this is currently happening. There's a rationale to use this data. In addition to the lockdowns and that we had in Brazil, we also had the possibility that the public could request to have access to that, the data. The data could be given to the public if there was a significant reason for doing so. That is a significant uh, reason, such as or goal, such as fighting against the pandemic. A different possibility is the heat maps. Here you see in Brazil, for instance, we identify during the day the people are connected to the mobile phones, and for instance, and in the evenings or at night, we check whether the people are connected to the same place. So you see the presence of mobiles that are connected to the various stations at the different times of the day. These are projects that, well, finally, there wasn't justice stated that privacy was not being violated. So we used the heat maps. We are not identifying the people. We are not giving any data about those people. Here you have the legal basis, the rationale for using the data from the point of view of the care. And we are currently trying to expand these bases with the Brazilian Institute of Statistics, who asked to take the personal data based on telephone surveys, and they decided that it was not adequate to share the data based on surveys conducted like that by telephone. In our guide, we are worried about understanding why the data, what the data is used for, and the life cycle of the data, and the safeguards that aim at protecting people and to protect the transparency about the data usage. So the communities of the technical community may respond to the queries by the public. So this is presented in a report. And today in Brazil, we are conducting, we are doing the contact tracing.
There are experiences that we have today, and if the person proves their prior consent, this has to be done on a voluntary basis. You cannot force anyone to do this. In addition to that, it's important that the type of data that is collected should be a minimum amount in order to not generate divergences. The first problem we come across is that of centralized contract tracing. For example, in Singapore and in other countries, and you also have something like that in Colombia. So if the government app, whether this is updated or not. Now, what is the problem? The information issued through Bluetooth signal tries to determine the proximity of people who detected a server, and this increases the risk in terms of security because this provides more information. So centralized projects in France and in other countries have higher amount of detail. And some countries say that the risk is so clear that some authorities are taking a step backwards and recommending to paralyze this kind of activity in the understanding that This really does not protect the information, personal information. There is contact tracing also, which is decentralized, and this has to do with random keys and also the storage in the devices themselves. And this is not done through a central authority. Of course, there is a certain type of risk in several projects that exist today, and we are aware that these do have vulnerabilities, but apparently this is less problematic. So we have to decide which is the contact tracing modality we choose. So even if the government of Brazil chooses something different, let us learn from the experience of Latin American countries. Let me share with you the experience of research conducted analyzing, sorry, this is in Colombia. So we have the theoretical and the practical aspect of this project. This is the documentation. And secondly, it is necessary to have harmonization with this guideline. A document was signed in April, which has practical recommendations. We also included that in our study. We counted on the participation of other organizations and agencies. And the elections of the governments also have to be in line with the recommendations of the community. WHO has regulations in place regarding international health. And in our understanding, there are some tests that can be carried out. I won't go into the details, but I invite you to read this document. In the work we carry out, we want to include a practical aspect regarding the use of contact tracing. We have to be efficient. So there's a wide debate stating that the contact tracing technologies are good for those cases of the countries where there is an increase in the outbreaks, but not in those cases where the curve has flattened, as is the case of Brazil. Secondly, this election has to have legal support. The technical community should be able to participate in the debate. An impact report should be available prior to launching this app. These should be open source applications. For example, contact tracing should have a very wide distribution in the favelas in Brazil. If you enter into contact with a person, and depending on the area where you live, and we're speaking about neighborhoods where there is a high density of population, then you might receive false signals, or where the technology won't function so good because we're not taking into account the reality of the people who live in such contexts. This is not something that was presented by the government of Brazil. We don't have any open documentation on that so far. The government says that this is reliable because they use an Apple protocol, Apple and Google protocol, and this has been validated by the international community, and apparently this works. But of course, these are issues that we are proposing to the government. These are issues that are of concern of the technical community and also of the civil society. We have to continue making efforts so that the government can make better use of these technologies. So that is what I wanted to share with you. And that is all. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rafael. We will now would like to listen to someone who has a vision of what this implies to the governments, namely using this technology, etc. So we are going to listen to Luis Ricardo Oliva from the government of Panama. Welcome, Ricardo. We look forward to listening to your presentation from the standpoint of the governments. Thank you, Maria Paz. Once again, I'd like to thank the organization for inviting me, and I'd like to thank the panelists and the attendees. When we started with the first case in our country, it was very important to identify how our population was segmented, how we were identifying each of the cases, and how we were considering approaching each of the needs that part of our citizens had. That is why one of the very first things we did was to sign agreement with the Electoral Tribunal in Panama. This is the agency in charge of recording the citizens in our country. Once we signed that agreement, this would provide transparency in, and also data protection. They have the responsibility to protect the data, and they really are in charge of the custody of the personal data of our citizens. We also work with other civil society organizations that seek to achieve data protection. And we also work with the National Authority on Transparency. This is because much of the data had to be published in the event of this affecting some of the benefits that the government was providing to the citizens, and this regarding public funds. So having done that, we started to analyze which were the key points in terms of the population's needs. One of the main needs, taking into account the slogan "Stay at Home," was food, as well as all issues regarding to cleaning. So we had to identify which were the priorities. There are a large number of people who depend on informal businesses. So if they had to stay at home, it would be very difficult for them to have the necessary income and then to have access to food. Therefore, this required the use of private data using databases, and so identify these people and where they were located. That is why we signed agreements with different organizations, for example, the Social Security Agency, the Ministry of Social Development, the National Income Agency. We therefore signed a decree which laid down a program called Panama Solidario. Panama Solidario consisted in establishing an interministerial board, including all the ministries and agencies that would be dealing with the pandemic and where discussions would be taking place in terms of the needs resulting from the COVID. So we had to identify how we were going to tackle all these needs and how we would be solving them. So having identified this, we realized that there were 1.3 million Panamanians who were in vulnerable conditions. They had to be solved very rapidly. The executive issued a measure for those people that were not working and who were not retired. But we had to determine which were already receiving some kind of benefit from the government, some kind of pension from the government. We had to identify by geographical region, how we provide assistance to these people. We developed a digital plan whereby using your ID number, you could use it at a debit card at all supermarkets. This would include an encrypted algorithm whereby a generated code can validate the identity of the person. We signed agreement with certain shops. There are more than 500 shops throughout the country that already use this technology. We integrated all the databases to our system. In the same manner, we could also provide assistance to this segment of the population. Today, 25% of the population receives this benefit, which is $100 a month. This has helped these people to face their basic needs. This is per person. In the transparency portal, we have stated this, we have published this information, stating that these are government funds spent in order to achieve transparency. So we are protecting the data of the population. We use web services to identify whether the person has resources or not, but we don't provide such information to the shops. We just say how much money they still have available. This information is associated to the identity card of these people. At the same time, we started developing other platforms that had the advantage that when handling this information, we could also identify the COVID clusters that were occurring. We developed an AI algorithm based on WhatsApp and Telegram. This allowed us to have a close contact with these people, and we would then save all the steps trying to identify the person. These were already loaded in the system. So now we have the citizens portal in a website called Panama Digital. So this allowed us to see which were the symptoms the person was having and if that person required a rapid response team. We started using this information for the benefit of each citizen. We also issued the safeguards. In our country, we had curfew. The police had to be able to validate whether these individuals could be circulating or not along the street, or whether they were allowed to go out at a given time of the day.
So they started crossing that information, but always preserving the privacy for the benefit of the citizens. And we also started to identify other things that we had. So we contacted the telephone companies, and no internet service providers or no telephone companies will cut services during the pandemic. And then this was a very good thing for all the people, so that all citizens may have access to the internet with no interruptions. And they were also expanded their bandwidth for everybody with less than 20 megabits per second. They expanded it as long as they had broadband, and in some cases taking it to 150 megabits, including the educational websites that were free of charge if they were using their mobile phones. But recently we signed an agreement so that 700,000 students could have access to the educational platforms that we developed free of charge and made available in the internet. This is a service that we agreed with the ISPs to have all the citizens connected. I think that this was a big a significant step forward because of all the problems that we've had, having a right to the information and being able to work and to get educated, all this has been maintained thanks to the internet networks. We also started developing a project to massify the bandwidth in the country. They just approved an increase in the funding for this purpose. And in very short time, we saw that 70,000 new people are now having access to the internet. They were given the tools to start getting connected. So this is a benefit for the citizens. So we can say that much of the success that we had as a country was thanks to the collaboration, the partnership with the companies that engaged, committed themselves not to cut services to the citizens, despite lack of payments. And finally, we have developed the notifications based on Google and Apple algorithms. And we have been very careful with this in the understanding that we were pressed. We received the pressure by some sectors, especially by the corporate sector, that wanted us to draw data to track contacts. But we were firm, stating that we needed to preserve the privacy of the data. And no matter the pressures that we had, we decided to protect people's private data. And until we could have a really robust platform in the operation systems that would not ensure, if the privacy was not ensured, we wouldn't use them. So we developed multiple apps, or we encourage, for instance, the use of WhatsApp or other means of communication so that people could contact us, or even with a telephone call. So this is how we developed it. The idea was to avoid using tracking platforms that would jeopardize all the effort of the government. So we always considered that the privacy needs to be maintained, and we committed ourselves to only notify the people who agreed to be notified that they had been in contact with somebody that was COVID positive. Thank you. Now with this, we finish this session. We have some minutes left to receive questions from the audience. It would be interesting to be able to interact directly with the members of the panel. Now we have the Q&A session. Let's see what people have written. Leah, we'd like to hear the questions. Well, maybe she's having technical problems. Maybe our Q&A secretary is having problems. So let me ask. Let's start with the end. There's a question for Luis Oliva. We receive a question from Panama. They say, what is going to happen with the sensitive data that you mentioned when the health crisis is over and the situation improves? This is a very frequent question that is asked when systems like this are implemented. So what are the time limits for operating these systems, and how long are you going to preserve that, to store that information? Luis? Can you hear me? Could you hear a question, Luis? I think we've lost him. We've lost him, yes. So let's move forward with another question. Probably it has to do with Laura's intervention about the information gathered by Facebook. And another participant in the audience, Deidre, asks about how the map in the world shows that there's much more abundance of data and concentration of data than the populations that are seen there. How can that be used? How could that be used to implement strategies or solutions when you need information, but and how does Facebook face that challenge? Laura, could you share your view?
Sure. Mind for me as well. As you've seen, we did have a tremendous growth in our partnership globally around the world since March. And so we do have, I would say, a great density of partners in North America as well as Europe. I will say I am proud that we have over 25 partners in the LATAM region, and we have around 20 in sub-Saharan Africa. So I am happy to say that we do have representation in the Global South for sure. But I think there's absolutely more work to be done. And I think that there is active recruitment of leading universities and data scientists in these regions. I also think that there's work on Facebook's behalf to make our tooling work in low bandwidth environments and to make our onboarding process something that is easier for people to do, potentially from things like text message or WhatsApp. These sound like basic changes, but what we found is that sometimes we will give a presentation to a bunch of African data scientists, but then because our tools are mostly onboarded through a traditional email address, we'll have drop-off rates of people using particular tools that we potentially use in our daily lives, but maybe aren't as ubiquitous in particular parts of the world. So we're really trying to think about, is there a way that researchers can access our tools potentially through mobile? Can they be onboarded through things like text or WhatsApp? And then also continuing to do a little bit of active recruitment through our existing partners. We find that in the research community, people know each other pretty well across different universities. And so relying on the partners that already exist in the Global South to help us find those institutions that we're not yet working with, who we should be working with.
Gracias, Laura. Thank you very much, Laura.
Thank you, Laura. I think that there are no more specific questions in the Q&A of our session, but I think that just around wrapping up, as we lost Luis, that could have answered the question as to the limits in the usage of the data and how these systems get dismantled once the emergency is over. Maybe Rafael could tell us about the relevance this has and how this may be considered when designing these systems. You, with data privacy, when you're working on data privacy and your experience, what have you found about it? And maybe there are some specific data that could give us a hint as to what happens when that is not defined previously. I'm going to speak Portuguese, so I'm going to use a translation. There is a case that I didn't mention in my presentation, I didn't address it. That is the case of IBGE, the Brazilian Research Institute. They tried to convince the government to transfer all the data of names, telephones, and addresses of the telecommunications companies in Brazil to conduct a research on unemployment and the impact of COVID-19 on employment, and doing this on the phone. So they passed a decree establishing a number of criteria. For instance, IBGE will be the only one to have access to the data. And once the research is completed, the data are going to be deleted. So they can only be used if they are anonymous. And so even with all these safeguards, the bar in Brazil and the Supreme Federal Court um, um, ruled that this decree was not constitutional, because despite the fact that the government promised that they would remove the data, people didn't trust the government, and there were not enough guarantees that the data would be removed and they would no longer be available. So those were considered to be empty promises, because it was in the decree, but we know that there's a difference between what really happens in real life. And the General Supreme Court stated that data privacy is uh, a human right, and that it is important because the court will may determine which of the data that may be transferred, but always meeting the institutional safeguards. This implies that there should be a third party that could measure the risks. But Brazil doesn't have a national authority for the protection of personal data. And in addition to that, Brazil has been involved in a number of controversial issues about the way they use data. For instance, they take addresses and they take photographs of drivers, and they try to give that to the intelligence agencies, and they sometimes without a specific reason. So, and they are even planning to expand the use of the data, for instance, by the army. So as a result, people are people mistrust. So even if the Supreme Court said, well, even if they promise that they are going to delete those data or to remove them and they will no longer be available, we don't believe that. So they stated that it was necessary for the government to create an authority for the protection of personal data. But if the government does that just to meet the demands, those demands, and to do what the authority, if the authority for personal data protection is not trusted, it's going to be useless. And in South America, and even with the very deep economic crisis, we see that the governments are reluctant to spend more money. And they argue that they can't spend the money, and thus they avoid making any changes. We can show the government that they can save by obtaining that type of authority. So it's also our concern. We decided to show the government and all the companies that it is advantageous to comply, to abide by the law on personal protection, data protection.
This prevents creating obstacles. So if we don't have the criteria, the government will have more spending. We have to go back with several measures and cancel some of the measures. So this is a very important component. So the situation is far more complex than asking the government or an agency to exclude a database. We really have to see how we manage to do this. Thank you, Rafael. So with that, we'll be closing the first block of this session with these challenges in fact, of seeing the normal potential that data have, but also how the government's data, the use of data, and so on, have to be transparent so as to strike the balance between the use of information, which we saw as explained by Laura and other panelists, but at the same time, considering the limitations to adequately protect this data and prevent having abusive use of these data and not to affect the rights of the inhabitants of the region. Thank you very much. We now give the floor back to the Master of Ceremonies so she can tell us about the way forward. The second part of the session will have to do with transparency and access to information during the pandemic. Thank you, Maria Paz, and thank you to the panelists for your participation. We'll now have a brief break, a 5-minute break, and we resume with the second segment. Thank you.